Getting to know the whales, this is something has challenged naturalists and biologists for centuries, and one can argue it still does today to in some respect. Especially if you compare that to the research done on terrestrial mammals, for instance. They were just simply out of reach, these whales. And don't take my word for it. Let's see what the famous Scottish surgeon anatomist John Hunter had to say in 1787. He says, "Our unfitness to pursue our researchers in the unfathomable waters." And he goes on, "The anatomy of the larger animals, when they are procured in a proper state, can be well ascertained, as do any others, dead structure being readily investigated. But even such opportunities seldom occur, because those animals are only to be found in distant seas, which no one explores in pursuit of natural history." Yeah, and well, Hunter was lamenting about all of this. Whaling was in full swing. Yet even then, there's very little access to specimens for these naturalists. So he goes on, some of these aquatic animals yielding substances which have become articles of traffic, and in quantity sufficient to render them valuable as objects of profit, the researchers of the naturalists are only considered as secondary points, if considered at all. So that kind of gives you the state of mind a few centuries ago, and the frustration for naturalists that be having very little to no access to whales, other than maybe the stranded species, the stranded whales. Cetology, the term cetology was first coined by the French naturalist and clergyman Pierre-Joseph Bonaterre in his Tableau encyclopédique et méthodique, when he proclaimed, "J'y consacré le mot cétologie, composé de racines grecques, kytos and logos." So he introduces the term. Actually, he even makes it his title of this encyclopedic work here about whales. Already noting that the terms of ichthyology and ornithology for the study of birds and fishes and birds here respectively were already in use. So he basically combines the Greek word kytos for whales and logos, the scientific discourse, and makes it into cetology. Now, cetology is also chapter 32 in Herman Melville's epic novel Moby Dick, where he momentarily takes the reader away from the whaling narrative into a humorous, I think hilarious even sometimes, and pseudo-scientific discourse on the systematics of whales. If you haven't read Moby Dick, do yourself a favor, go this summer, take the book and go through it. It's really a fantastic read. So that's my plug on Moby Dick and Melville. Okay. The genesis of cetology, and arguably much of biology and zoology, really starts with the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle enrolled in Plato's academy at age 17. He stayed there for 20 years. He was a gifted student and eventually would actually become a teacher there himself. However, over the years, Aristotle became restless and increasingly starting to question Plato's philosophies. And when Plato died, the directorship of the academy did not go to Aristotle. Instead, it went to Plato's nephew. Disillusioned in some kind of a self-exile, Aristotle left Athens for Assos, which is now on the Turkish coast. This is here where he met up with friends. He got married there, and he's also met up with a friend, a fellow student from the academy that was Theophrastus. Now, Theophrastus is a botanist, or was a botanist, and he's now regarded as the father of botany. And Theophrastus was living on the island of Lesbos. So he invites Aristotle to stay with him for a few years. And so Aristotle did. And it was here on the island of Lesbos, along the shores of the lagoon near the ancient town of Pyrrha, where Aristotle took notes of the natural world around him. Now, the lagoon is actually now the Gulf of Colony, as it's called today. It's here where Aristotle observed birds. He opened chicken eggs. He visited fish markets, talked to fishermen, dissected cuttlefish, and yes, he observed dolphins, likely from shore, but possibly even he traveled maybe with some fishermen as well. Now, centuries later, we understand that Aristotle certainly made some errors. However, his observations and writings on dolphins have withstood the test of time and are still valid today. I mean, Aristotle, for instance, understood that cetaceans give birth to live young, viviparous or viviparous, if you're American or British, um, provide milk and suckle their young, breathe air through a blowhole, and are provided with lungs. Now, these are all mammalian hallmarks as we recognize them today. However, even the term and concept mammalia was not even yet coined. That wouldn't happen until Linnaeus' 10th edition of Systema Naturae. And we'll meet up with Linnaeus here shortly. But Aristotle also observed and described dolphin feeding behavior. He listened to vocalizations and mentioned they give out squeaks and moans. Of course, these were on the surface. Aristotle was certainly not equipped with a hydrophone. He also learned that dolphins can live 25 to 30 years. And fishermen actually nick their tails. That's what he writes. So I would guess that these dolphins would end up in fishermen's nets, and they would be released, and then would be nicked by the fishermen, and it would be recited. So it's actually a sort of a first documented record of a research technique called marker and recapture that is in some form still used today, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. He also observed porpoises in the Euxine, as it's called. It was the Black Sea. So it's remarkable insights 2,400 years ago. I will not go into the larger, broader Aristotelian classification system. It's called the Scala Naturae, or the natural ladder. Safe to say that Aristotle took a more philosophical approach to classification rather than an evolutionary one, of course. So he understands, birds, animals that flew in the sky, they're birds, and animals that lived in the water. But he also looked at animals that had blood, red blood, actually, really, and the animals that were bloodless, which really now recognizes the invertebrates. And he really, if you see, sometimes they say, well, Aristotle actually still classified them with the fishes, the whales, and that's not true. He actually really separated them out. Now, what we call the terrestrial mammals were in Greek were called tetrapoda. In Latin, it was quadrupeds. But he certainly put him in a separate group here. But anyway, remarkable insights back then. Eventually, Aristotle goes back to Athens. He opens up his own academy called the Lyceum, where he used his notes and writings for his lectures. While none of these original manuscripts, I would guess, be all done in papyrus, survived, these texts have been preserved through many translations, first made in the Islamic world, and later on in the 13th century were even translated into Latin. And then would see them coming back into vogue in the Renaissance. Eventually, all his texts would end up in these different books, although I don't think that Aristotle ever meant to have these written books. They were separate texts, but they eventually ended up in these Historia Animalium, the Inquiries of Animals, which is a wonderful English translation by Darcy Wentworth Thompson, which is still available if you go in A-Books, for instance. And the Parts of Animals and a Generation of Animals is still incredible read today. If you read through that book, there's still a certain freshness about his observations even today. Okay, Aristotle. So yeah, not a whole lot of added was after Aristotle's observations. I should mention the exception is Pliny the Elder, who wrote extensively on the subject of natural history, including whales and dolphins, in his ninth book of the Historia, Naturalis Historia. Pliny referenced Aristotle in his book quite a lot, but also added his own basically anecdotal accounts. And unfortunately, some of these were of little scientific value, but interesting nonetheless. The poet Arrian riding the dolphin, for instance. While Pliny may not have observed cetaceans in the way that Aristotle has, we know he was witness to a well-documented event when a killer whale blundered into Rome's city harbor of Ostia. It was at that point Emperor Claudius who ordered his Praetorian guards to net off the harbor and kill the poor animal as a public spectacle. But obviously of very little scientific value, but it was a well-documented event. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, much of Europe plunges into the Dark Ages. The church has a tight grip on society. Anything that is seen questioning the central role of the church was not tolerated, including science or scientific inquiry. Now we see whales reduced to monstrous fishes serving as religious allegories in his medieval illustrated works called bestiaries. Probably more of interest is, if we go into the north of Europe, is the Norse Vikings. Here we see a couple of little sagas and tales that are a little bit more of interest to us. The saga of Otera of Halagoland, the account of northern Norway. This was actually written for King Alfred at that time. This will be in the 9th century. His work superficially talks about whales, but more clearly shows that the Norse Vikings were conducting whaling. And probably a century later, we already have some hints of Basque whaling as well. But yet, neither the Norse Vikings nor the, particularly, and even more so, the Basque really left us with any kind of natural history writings on whales. Of more interest, perhaps, is the Koningsskuggsja, or the Speculum Relicale, they would call it Royal Mirror. This is a didactic work that reads like a dialogue between an old king, the King Haakon Haakonsson, and his son Magnus Lagabøte. It's in a chapter 12 of this book, and there's actually a wonderful English translation of it too, I think by Marcellus, and I forgot the name right now. Anyway, well, you can still get it. It's specifically about whales, this chapter 12. The Norwegian scholar and zoologist Gustav Guldberg was, for the most part, able to identify the Old Norse names of whales. And interesting to note, you see them highlighted here in red, is they understood the difference between the bowhead or the Greenland whale and the right whale, something that mystified systemizers well into the 19th century. So it's remarkable. The whalers knew the differences. It's just scientists were a little bit lagging behind on that. But many whalers, of course, were not interested in the natural history. Okay, we are now roughly in the 14th century. We're entering a period where the church is losing its grip on society. There's more room for individualism. It also is an era that marks the beginning of the age of discovery and a renewed interest and veneration of the ancients. So the works of Aristotle and Pliny are back in vogue. And we see many translations, and this was aided by the invention of the printing press, the Gutenberg press in 1450. Now science was able to become more accessible to a wider audience. So of course, there's still only for people that can still afford these books that were written at that time. In this period, in the Renaissance, the first person who would publish anything meaningful on the marine animals or marine fauna, including cetaceans, was the French naturalist Pierre Belon. Belon had traveled extensively through the Middle East and all the way to Egypt, and wrote his book, a very small one at first, a tiny little book about the unusual marine fishes that wasn't done in French, L'Histoire naturelle des étranges poissons marins, and quickly expanded this work into Latin, so making that much more wider available to other countries. And it is remarkable. That was in 1553. And then, of course, there was another French translation after that from this expanded work. So Pierre Belon really was, in many respects, the second person after Aristotle to meaningfully add anything to the science of whales. Belon would reference his works on Aristotle and Pliny as well, but also added his own observation, as you can see here on these woodcuts. Looking at the illustrations here, we can see that Belon clearly performed his own dissections. We actually see a bottlenose dolphin here with a fetus that was still probably a near-term young animal here that was probably stranded, my guess. But you've certainly done these dissections. We also see a reproductive tract here of a porpoise, and also shows the differences between the marsouin, the porpoise, and the dolphin. So incredible back then. So inspired by Belon, in rapid succession, we see other naturalists soon publish their books on aquatic animals. First of is the French naturalist Guillaume Rondelet in 1554. And it's roughly about the same time, a little later, was Conrad, the Swiss naturalist Conrad Gessner. The latter copying the woodcuts illustrations by Olaus Magnus, who is probably better known for his Carta Marina, still showing these whales as monstrous fishes. I guess would later be regarded as the father of zoology because he wrote extensively on natural history. And other naturalists I'm not highlighting here are the Italian naturalist Ippolito Salviani, which is a gorgeous book on fishes. You can find it online, and Ulysses Aldrovandi in 1606. After the Basque whaling diminished in the late 1500s, a new whaling era began around Spitsbergen, what we now call Svalbard, and around Jan Mayen and Greenland. The British started in 1611, the Dutch a year later in 1612. From this area we call the Greenland whaling period, two whale naturalists would make significant contributions to the natural history of whales. The first was Friedrich Martens, a German ship's barber and medic. He was not quite a physician, who wrote about this account in on a German whaling ship from Hamburg to Spitsbergen. En is called die Spitzbergische oder Grönlandische Reisebeschreibung getan in the year 1671. Long title, he was written actually in 1675. The first half of this book reads like a logbook on his travels, whereas the second part of the book is really more of interest that gives detailed accounts on the flora and fauna around Spitsbergen and the beautiful little plates. So you can see one of them here on whales. We see actually the first images actually no longer as scaling kind of fishy monsters, but probably more like the whales are supposed to be. And this plate would actually be copied for centuries later still too. And we see actually the first image of a fin whale below that on the bottom of that plate, which would also be copied. In essence, Linnaeus actually would actually base that on Friedrich Martens' account. So you can actually almost say that this fin whale you see here is the holotype specimen of the fin whale that he, but we'll meet Linnaeus here later on. The second person of interest is the Dutch whaling commander Cornelis Gijsbert's Zorgdrager. Sorry, Dutch is not a pretty language here. In his Bloeiende opkomst der aloude hedendaagse Groenlandse visserij. This was published in 1720. An incredible account on whaling, very detailed on the whole whaling operations in that time, in that period in 1720. But also gives us some natural history on whales, and particularly on the bowhead whale, which was the main quarry at that time. Now we're entering an era called the Age of Enlightenment. It is beginning dates really depends on who you ask. Some believe it begins with the French philosopher René Descartes, who famously declared cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. That was in 1637. Yet others believe it starts with the English physicist Sir Isaac Newton, who published his Principia Mathematica in 1687. Anyway, regardless, the era is defined by empiricism. And if you're looking at the Oxford dictionaries, it is the theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience, stimulated by the rise of experimental science. It's something that actually Aristotle was already doing 2,400 years ago. It marks the birth of, really the birth of modern science. And it is an era in which we see the appearance of the encyclopedia, the first ones by Diderot. These were all done, arranged alphabetically. And later on, we see other encyclopedic works, probably more arranged by topic. Fueled by discoveries made in other parts of the world, this era is dominated by systemizers who saw it as their duty to organize and classify God's perfect creations. They strongly believed in the immutability of species, so they didn't think that species would change. I mean, God's perfect creations wouldn't change. So absolutely no evolutionary thought at that time. One of the first and foremost examples in this respect was the Parson naturalist John Ray, a clergyman who saw the duty of the study of the natural world as an important extension of his religious duties. So, and then we see some other work here too by Theodore Klein in his second book on, and many of these writers would actually also be referenced by Linnaeus. Mathurin Jacques Brisson, who actually in his second edition in 1762 actually gave us the order Cetacea. That came from him, from Jacques Brisson. Otto Fabricius was a clergyman set up in his missionary in Greenland and wrote extensively about the natural history, armed with Linnaeus works. about the flora and fauna in Greenland. Wonderful, a remarkable book. Peter Artedi is an interesting figure. He was a young man, he was a contemporary of Linnaeus, was a friend who was actually a fellow student in Uppsala in Sweden with Linnaeus. They met up in Holland. Peter Artedi actually contributed much of what Linnaeus would write on fishes and whales, actually. So Peter Artedi in turn took a lot of information from John Ray and others like Robert Sibbald, for instance. So interesting period at that point. And yeah, I already alluded to Carl Linnaeus now, where I have to mention him. So we have to spend some time with the Swedish botanist and systemizer. Even though he was not all too familiar with whales himself, Linnaeus looms large in zoology and biology. He was born in Rasshult, Sweden, 1707. Passionate botanist. He really loved plants, very much like his father, who was a priest, I believe. He had his early education in Uppsala, Sweden, and then he got his doctorate in Harderwijk in Netherlands in 1735. That university in Harderwijk was known for a very short residency. You can get your doctorate in a matter of weeks. So I was here in Holland and Leiden, actually, where he wrote his first edition of the Systema Naturae, on the work on natural systems in 1735. But it was in his 10th edition in 1758 that we now regard as the starting point of zoological nomenclature. It was here where I introduced mammalia, remember, where we talked about Aristotle. So this is where the first time we see the word mammalia. This is where also humans become mammals. Yeah, and then it's also the first work that he consistently used binomials with the genus name and the species specific name. And if you had an example, if beforehand, looking at the blue whale, for instance, Robert Sibbald, still in 1692, referred it as Balena tripinnis maxilla inferiora rotunda. Well, now that's a mouthful. Linnaeus shortened it to Balena musculus. So it had an incredible, profound influence, of course, to zoology here. And we're looking at actually of the page. Here we have the 3 pages, including all the cetaceans introduced by Linnaeus, 8 of which are still valid today, which is the narwhal, bowhead whale, fin whale, blue whale, sperm whale, harbor porpoise, common dolphin, and killer whale. So these are the ones that he introduced here first in 1758. And those were the original descriptions, because it is the starting point for zoological nomenclature. That means that any descriptions of whales and dolphins made prior to that date are invalid. Linnaeus species descriptions are short and at times somewhat ambiguous. So for centuries, there was much confusion as to what species of Linnaeus was really referring to, and in some respects still is. And it wasn't until 1898 when the American zoologist Frederick William True was able to bring some clarity by hunting down Linnaeus sources. Yet, it may still be possible that some of these species entries are in reality an amalgam of different species. And we possibly think that the Delphinus delphis may also be a bottlenose dolphin. We don't know. Or in the same thing with Delphinus orcas. It may well be an amalgam, simply because Linnaeus himself didn't really know it. Anyway, this period is not solely defined by classifiers and compilers. We can also see the first pioneering anatomists emerge. And one of the first and foremost and prominent figures in this regard is the English physician Edward Tyson. Tyson, astonishingly detailed account of the dissection of a harbor porpoise was done in 1680. And it was a pivotal moment in cetology and a very influential work. Even more so, the descriptive text was enhanced with 2 beautifully, exquisitely detailed fold-out plates. And this leaves the reader with little doubt as to what was being examined and explained in the text. And we can see these illustration plates down here. And actually even looked at the first sort of in the thoracic wall of the Rhetia mirabilia. He was the first one to discover that in cetaceans. And we'll talk a little bit about that here later on. In my introduction, I already talked about the Scottish surgeon John Hunter, who was kind of frustrated about the lack of access to specimens. Hunter followed in the footsteps of his older brother William and set up shop in London. And he was keenly interested in comparative anatomy and quickly amassed a sizable collection of specimens, many of which were now used in his famous lectures. And actually, a lot of them you can find now in the and the Museum, the Royal College in London. I think that's being renovated right now. I'm not entirely sure. Hunter was the first examined a few porpoises stranded near the mouth of the Thames. And you can see a couple of little illustrated plates here. These were attributed to Jan van Rijmstijk, who was a medical illustrator in Holland, who worked together with William Hunter, but later also with John Hunter. These illustrations, as far as I can ascertain, were never published, and these were likely used in his lectures. Eventually, Hunter would obtain some bottlenose whale, orca, minke whales, and others, with the help of a lot of friends and students. And Hunter even paid for a person, a ship surgeon, I believe, on a whaling vessel to bring back specimens. And however, that costly endeavor only yielded a piece of skin with a few barnacles, so that went nowhere. Eventually, all Hunter's accumulative cetological work would finally be published in one seminal paper in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London in 1787. And this publication is still very much of an interesting read today, and it had it influenced cetologists here for centuries later. This was really a seminal work. On the other side of the North Sea, we have the Dutch physician, anatomist, and polymath. He was an anthropologist, physician, naturalist, paleontologist. He was even a midwife, a polymath, incredible, busy man. Petrus Camper, actually, I should call that's we had pronounced it, gained his interest in whales when ear bones of a stranded sperm whale were donated to him, and he gave a wonderful description of it in 1767. That led Camper to seek out more specimens and for examination. Unfortunately, Camper failed to publish much of this during his own lifetime. Camper had desperately hoped he would co-author his work with the French naturalist Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte du Buffon, as part of the encyclopedic series L'Histoire naturelle générale et particulière. Buffon, who initiated this partnership, actually was more interested in style than scientific substance. Buffon died in 1788, and the project never really materialized. And it was up to Camper's son, Adrian, to publish Camper's work on cetacean posthumously in 1820, more than 30 years after Camper's death, with notes by Georges Cuvier in this work. Even though it was published in 1820, this work really squarely is in the Age of Enlightenment. Now, Buffon's encyclopedic entry about whales would eventually be completed by Comte de la Cepede, who took over the Histoire naturelle series from Buffon after his death. And here he is. The full name is Bernard Germain Etienne de la Ville-sur-Illon, Comte de la Cepede. Yeah, he would have benefited from Linnaeus' binomial. Indeed, La Cepede, who'd weathered the French Revolution, took over the Natural History Encyclopedic series from Buffon, as I said. La Cepede joined the Jardin du Roi, as it was first called, and later, after the revolution, was called Jardin des Plantes, where he was in charge of the study of reptiles and fishes in Paris. This was in Paris. La Cepede wrote his work on cetaceans in 1804. And actually this work, and you can see the plates here, you'll see in the upper left corner, you'll see they kind of basically copying those plates from Friedrich Martens we saw earlier. Actually, in this work, he introduces us a few whales that are now valid still today, with the minke whale, Commerson's dolphin, for instance, the southern right whale dolphin, I believe, and a few genera like the Hyperoodon, which is the genus for the bottlenose whales, and the Balanoptera, which is the genus for all the fin whales. But yeah, still a remarkable work. And I have to say that La Cepede never saw any whales himself in his life. Remarkable man. Whaler naturalist too. So we already saw the first naturalists, these whaler naturalists, the Friedrich Martens and Zorgdrager. Here we have, now we're squarely in the 19th century, and there's two whaler naturalists bookend this period really nicely, where the first one is William Scoresby. and the other one is the Charles Melville Scammon. Scoresby wrote the 2-volume work on the account of the Arctic regions of the northern whale fishery, and gives a full account of the Arctic, not only on the whaling operations, but just on the Arctic, on weather, on ocean currents, but also natural history accounts about the whales and the Arctic whales, like the narwhal and the bowhead whale, which was a remarkable works. Later on in the end of the 19th century, we have Charles Melville Scammon, who maybe some of you are maybe more familiar with his work. Scammon, of course, discovered as a whaler, discovered these birthing lagoons of these calving lagoons of gray whales in the Baja, Mexico, and wrote an incredible treatise. He had on board, he had a naturalist called William Healy Dahl, who wrote extensively, who also contributed in this work as well. So a remarkable book. If you haven't seen, there are some very cheap little, you can find these, I think for $1, you still find some of the facsimile works by that. Okay. While the 18th century was dominated by systemizers, the 19th century can be labeled as the triumph of comparative anatomy. It really was an area, it was also an era where evolutionary thought was getting some traction. We'll talk a little bit about that. The first and foremost figure in this regard was Georges Cuvier, the French zoologist and paleontologist. Although fossil bones were already known since the Antiquities, it was Cuvier who established without a doubt that they represented extinct life forms. He did so through comparative anatomy, basically comparing the bones with the extant or living vertebrates, and whales included. Cuvier, being a good Protestant, explained these extinctions as being caused by local catastrophic historic events like floodings and earthquakes, when species would perish and vanish, only to be newly created by God himself. His theory of catastrophism put him at odds with his contemporary and fellow French colleague Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who advanced his theory of transmutations. But Lamarck never really fully fleshed out this in a similar detail as Cuvier did. Cuvier's work would culminate eventually in an important publication. First is the Recherche sur le ossement fossile, research on the fossil bones. You'll see two plates here. These are plates from 1836. A remarkable work. I will see some of even the fossil bones of whales in these plates. The other work, and this actually established Cuvier as the father of both paleontology and comparative anatomy. So he established these fields. Cuvier also busied himself with classification in the animal kingdom in his book called the Règne Animal, Animal Kingdom. Cuvier was more of a lumper. He was hesitant to divide the whales into many species. He still believed, for instance, that bowhead and right whale was still one single species. Remember, the Basque already knew the differences between these two. Both works saw many additions and during his lifetime, during and after his lifetime. It's impossible for me to highlight all the anatomical discoveries and key figures in this period. I will just highlight a few of them. I already talked about the arterial plexus, the Rhetia mirabilia, here found in the thoracic wall of cetaceans. That we now know these are actually basically a reservoir to hold oxygen-rich blood that helps deliver this blood to these vital organs while they were going on long bouts of dives. It was already discovered by Edward Tyson in the 17th century, but this, unbeknownst to each other, these two anatomists would actually research and describe this arterial plexus in numbing detail. So yeah, unbeknownst to each other, the French naturalist Gilbert Bréchet and the German physician Karl Ernst nearly simultaneously published their findings in these extraordinary plates. Someone else I have to mention is the Danish zoologist and anatomist, Daniel Friedrich Eschricht. If the name sounds familiar, actually Eschricht is actually commemorated in the genus of the gray whale. Eschricht made meaningful contributions to understanding of the Nordic whales in the northern regions. Eschricht was one of the first to examine baleen whale fetuses, for instance. And this happened through a friend in Iceland. And of course, he got much of his specimens, of course, from the Danish colonies in Iceland and the Faroe Islands and Greenland. Much of Eschrichts's output, like his other Scandinavian colleagues, the Johann Reinhardt and Wilhelm Liljeborg, were published in his way in their native language. It wasn't it was actually the British zoologist William Henry Flower who understood the value of expanding the reach of their important work and made sure that these were translated in English. And this was in the memoirs on the cetaceans by Professor Eschricht, Reinhardt, and Liljeborg. Remarkable person here too. The pinnacle of comparative anatomy was exhibited in his extraordinary bone atlas and of extant and fossil whales by the Belgian zoologist Pierre-Joseph van Beneden and his friend, close friend and colleague in Paris, that Paul Gervais, was a paleontologist. And they employed a scientific illustrator, Luc-Joseph Delahaye, who was asked to visit museums throughout Europe and document these skeletal specimens. And these resulted in an atlas of more than 60 gorgeous, 60 full fold-out plates. And this work was published between 1868 and 1879 and were published in several livraisons, they call them, deliveries, installments, and eventually published the whole thing in 1880. A remarkable work, and it's still unparalleled and consulted today. I use them for my work as well. I already talked a little bit about evolutionary thought. We already talked a bit about these evolutionary thinkers who were at pains to explain mutability of species and extinctions in a biblical context. And it was Charles Darwin, however, who was generally seen as the main advancer of evolutionary thought. This theory, however, did not come overnight. After Darwin's voyage on the Beagle, it was still took him decades to find his courage and his voice to fully flesh out his theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin's contemporary Alfred Russel Wallace independently arrived at a similar theory, and both gents published their sketch in 1858. But it was Darwin, however, who fully detailed his theory in his seminal work on the origin of species in 1859. And this was a pivotal publication, of course. It elicited much criticism, but also find biologists eagerly embracing it, as we'll see later on. The 19th century was not all about anatomy, of course. Distant colonies, colonial discoveries would bring back new specimens for museums awaiting formal description and taxonomic assignment. No one was more prolific, perhaps a little bit too prolific in this regard, than the British zoologist and keeper of zoology at the British Museum of Natural History in London, John Edward Gray. Gray was a classic closet naturalist, as they call him. I prefer maybe parlor naturalist anyway. He was a museum man with disdain for traveling explorers. Gray had a penchant to turn every specimen and sometimes even drawings that came into his possession as new species. While there was much praise for Gray for building up an impressive museum collection, almost from scratch really, there was also much criticism for his taxonomic splitting. And we see the quote here by William Henry Flower, who was actually his successor, who writes, "His tendency to multiply divisions and impose names almost at random, his want of accuracy in description, and his defective anatomical knowledge are exhibited in his writings on this group in their fullest." Yeah, ouch. Now, whaling changed drastically in 1860s with the invention of the harpoon gun by Sven Freund and the use of the steam-powered whale catchers, putting the swift blue and fin whales finally in reach of whalers. And if we recall John Hunter's frustration in regards of having access to specimens, it's this area that we see the first naturalist who gained access to a whaling station. It was the fisheries biologist Georg Ossian Sars, who was able to visit Sven Freund's first Vadsø whaling station in northern Norway in the Finnmark region. And he visited this station here on 2 occasions. And it was here that both blue and fin whales were caught on a regular basis. And if you look at the photo where you see a blue whale being butchered on the flensing deck in Vadsø, you'll see in the background a small little vessel. That is the Spes et Fides, which is the first steamer whale catcher in this period. Sars happened to be an excellent draftsman and gave us some of the first accurate illustrations of these balenopterids. And we see this illustration here of the first illustrations, good illustrations of a fin whale after Remember that illustration from Friedrich Martens here in the 1670s. On the other side of the Atlantic, the American zoologist and curator of mammals at the National Museum, now called the Smithsonian, is Frederick William True. I talked a little bit about him earlier in regards to Linnaeus. True was afforded access to whaling stations in Newfoundland and Canada. And it's this work here at these stations, this anatomical work that he did, really culminated in his important monograph of the whalebone whales of the Western North Atlantic. This book is actually even reprinted in 1983, I believe. True can be considered as, I think, is one of the most important and early contributors to the science of whales here in North America. And we'll see a couple of works here that I have listed, some of the important works that he had contributed to. Going back to Germany now, it's the German zoologist Willi Kuchenthal is overlooked in my view. Kuchenthal gave an important insights in cetacean embryology. He was able to obtain specimens from Norwegian whaling stations. Through careful research, Kuchenthal observed small, tiny little hind-limb buds, which would soon disappear as soon as the tail flukes emerge in their development. Kuchenthal was an ardent Darwinist. He was a student of Ernst Haeckel, and Ernst Haeckel can only be described as an uber-Darwinist who took Darwinism to the extreme. But Kuchenthal eagerly used Darwin's theory to explain the embryological observations in an evolutionary context. And I do have to mention briefly that the Norwegian zoologist Gustav Goldberg, who also observed and published on the hind limb buds around the same time, but it was Kuchenthal who stole his thunder. After whale population, we talked a little bit about the Norwegian whaling here in the North Atlantic, and after these were, the populations were nearly decimated in the North Atlantic, whaling operations moved, well, first to Newfoundland, but then soon moved down to the Antarctic in 1904. Alarmed by the enormous waste at the newly opened whaling stations in the Antarctic region of the British Falkland dependencies, the British zoologist and director of the British Museum, Sidney Harmer, pressed the need for better management of the remaining stock of whales. Thus, the British Discovery Investigations was born here in 1925. Really done to establish effective management for the remaining stocks of whales in that region. But they studied, and they did that on boats and also on the whaling stations themselves, looked at whale migration, feeding patterns, breeding frequency. They looked at whale prey. It's incredible, it's astonishing work, but also at the physical and biological aspects of the habitat. And these were all drawn up in there's 37 in total of volumes of discovery reports. You can still find them online. We talked, if you remember, we talked a little bit about the mark recapture with the fishermen when Aristotle noted that. This is, you see this mark here at this, and thank you on this photo here from the Dale Rice Library. This was a discovery mark, or a slug, basically. This was actually shot into the blubber of the whale. And then it was hoped that once a whale was captured, this mark would then be discovered and be sent back to, in this case, the British Museum, and it would be documented. This would be able to kind of get a sense of movement. This is basically the mark and recapture. It was incredible. The Discovery Investigations and it's still incredible read these reports. It had an incredible influence on cetology for decades and centuries to come. So another person I should mention is the American zoologist and later director of the US National Museum, Remington Kellogg. Kellogg had a keen interest in archaeocedes and the evolutionary history of whales. He published many papers on this subject and wrote this beautiful and excellent monograph on this topic in 1936. It was his interest in whales and his personal stellar reputation that would eventually thrust him into the arena of whaling regulation. Kellogg would be the US delegate to the first International Conference on Whaling that's in 1937, finally signed and ratified in 46. And Kellogg would play a pivotal role in forming what is now the IWC, the International Whaling Commission. To those of you who are ACS members, American Cetacean Society members, you have probably, hopefully, gotten your whale watcher in we highlighted this work to really about the first women that came into being in this field, who made their entry. The first one here, Barbara Lawrence, curator of mammals at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. She was a close collaborator with her husband, Bill Cheville, who we'll meet here in a minute. And before Barbara, there was even Madeleine Friand, as a French paleontologist and comparative anatomist at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. But very little known is about her life. I really hope to actually visit Paris soon again and find out a little bit more about her. She is really, in my book, I think might be the first woman to have contributed to cetology. But yeah, if you haven't, I hope that you have enjoyed that. The ACS Whale Watcher Journal, to me, that was a fantastic. I think it's something I'm so most proud of. Our most proud whale watcher, where we highlight 18 scientists, women scientists, in different parts of their career, and there's wonderful stories, personal stories about how they got into, how they entered the field, and it's hopefully that you and all of you enjoyed it. And we'll talk a little bit. We also talked about some of the earlier cetologists. So if you haven't joined ACS, then we'll get this done to you. So that's my plug. I already alluded to Bill Cheville, who, along with his wife, Barbara, of course, and the young Bill Watkins, pioneered research in cetacean bioacoustics. They produced the first recordings of whales. These were beluga whales in the Saguenay River in 1948. And eventually their work would culminate in they produced a vinyl record, which was made up available for the larger public. I do have to mention here, hopefully you can read this. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to it's a wonderful book that just recently came out, and it's published by the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It's called The Voices of Marine Mammals. And it details all the story about Cheville and Watkins, these pioneers in bioacoustics. Remarkable. So anyone who's interested in acoustics of whales, you owe it to self to. So go to the website for the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and you can document and you can purchase this book. It's absolutely. There's also a small little record in that too. It has a small little vinyl record in the back. So it's a fantastic book about the history of these pioneers. Okay. In 1938, Marine Studios opened in Florida. It housed a number of bottlenose dolphins. While first conceived as an underwater film studio, there was an immediate interest in the research possibilities with dolphins. The underwater viewing windows opened up an entire new world to scientists. Many pioneer scientists would take the opportunity of the facility to change its name, and the facility would actually change its name to Marineland of Florida. And we'll see Arthur McBride as the first curator, David Melba Caldwell, who actually documented these first signature whistles of dolphins, Margaret Travolga with her husband William, also looking at the behavior of dolphins. So yeah, so seen through today's lens, these studies on captive dolphins may no longer be palatable with some of you, but they are, like it or not, an important and inescapable part of the history of cetology, and contributed much to our understanding of dolphin cognition, vocalizations, and behavior. Cetology takes a bit of a strange, bizarre turn. The neuroscientist John Cunningham Lilly also took an interest in the possibility of captive dolphin studies. He was interested in the dolphin's cognitive abilities, but also in the idea of possible communication with extraterrestrial life. And why not start with dolphins? With interest in funding by the US Navy, Lilly opened up shop in St. Thomas on the US Virgin Islands. Here, a dolphin house was built, constructed in the rocks. And a young girl named Margaret Howe, living on the island, would become a volunteer who eventually come to live with a dolphin named Peter in the flooded rooms upstairs in the laboratory. Lilly had hoped to have Margaret teach the dolphin Peter English. After a few months, it became clear that this progress was not likely. At that point, Lilly started to experiment with LSD. That was back in vogue. This is the 1960s after all. And he also experimented with sensory deprivation, first on himself. Later, he administered LSD to a few dolphins in hopes to free up their communication skills. Eventually, Lilly lost funding and his reputation diminished. Lilly's bizarre research, however, did eventually influence and inspire true, valid research in dolphin cognition. And so the last profile here in my talk, person profile here is, and I have to mention, is Ken Norris, who so the naturalist and herpetologist, yes, he was an herpetologist, perfectly straddles, in my view, the transition from captive studies to the studies in the field. Norris entered the field of marine mammalogy as curator of the newly built Marineland of the Pacific in Palos Verdes, California in 1953. Eventually, he would also become involved with a new facility in Hawaii, assisting Karen Pryor and then her husband, Taylor Tap Pryor. And before long, interest grew into researching dolphins in the wild. And the Hawaiian spinner dolphins studies were a good example of this. And Norris would really go on to inspire countless young emerging cetologists to conduct long-term studies in the wild. We think, of course, of Bernd and Melanie Wersick, for instance, and Denise Hersing is another example of that, and many, many others. I believe we also have to mention that Norris was also instrumental in bringing international scientists together, representing many disciplines within the study of cetology. And their meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1963 would result in this seminal publication. We see the book here on whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And perhaps this was a precursor for forming the professional societies decades later. We don't know. But at this point, I'll just quickly, we're in this sort of a latter part, the last part of the 20th century to today. I'll just go over some of the research tools, technologies, and I'll round this off here. And hopefully you're still with me and not falling asleep yet. Photo identification. Using the natural markings of cetaceans in photos proved to be an important, incredibly important, non-lethal and non-invasive research technique to identify individuals and learn more about their social relationship and population structures. It was pioneered by Chuck Girard in humpback whales and looking at the undersides of flukes in Alaska. By Mike Bigg, of course, many of you are familiar with the saddle patches in killer whales in the Pacific here, in the Pacific Northwest. Roger Payne, looking at these, the callosity patterns in right whales in Argentina. And this technique, of course, is still very much in use and it's still valid. Some of you were actually online here. I know you are involved in this. Now, of course, instead of using film rolls or digital cameras, have it taken over and making the process so much easier and quicker. Another tool is something that probably dates back to the 1930s initially, but we see its emergence in cetacean. The use of cetaceans is the molecular biology, genetics, looking at the DNA. Obviously, this is a field that I'm less familiar with, so I have to pardon my ignorance here. It's an incredible tool, however, that has been refined over the years to help and give insight in population structure, species identification. It aids with systematics, looking at trophic ecology of the prey, and looking at immune responses like stress levels. We see the image here too of now we see the use of dogs sniffing out the whale poop and being scooped, brought to the lab, and we can find out a little bit more information about the whales. We can take biopsy darts, we see that here. So it's an incredible tool that has been refined over the years. And there's, of course, new technologies. Some of the technologies have been around far longer. Of course, aerial surveys have been around for a very long time. With airplanes, even whaling vessels actually used airplanes to spot whales, of course. Nowadays, we have these unmanned aerial vehicles, the drones. And here you see a snot bot that actually is able to scoop up a little bit sample of whale blow, basically, and bring that to the lab. We have unmanned surface vehicles, and we see an incredible dizzying array of acoustic equipment, like satellite tags, passive acoustic equipment that's been anchored in the ocean, and we can pick up sounds, recordings like the sea pods that are certainly helpful for porpoises that are on a higher frequency. So I know you really need an acoustician to go through this slide with more detail. So I invite someone to do that at some point. But yeah, these are, we just see some, just a selection of the many, many technological advancements here. In the 20th century, we saw the emergence of professional societies for the first time. It's taken that long. It's amazing. We see, of course, the European Association for Aquatic Mammals in 72, the Society for Mammalogy not until 1981. If you think that ACS has been around since 1967. European Cetacean Society in 87, and the Latin Society here for aquatic mammals in 1996. And we see just highlighting just a few scientific journals here. So it's my last slide here. The image here of the most recent biennial conference in Barcelona, Spain, co-hosted by the Society for Marine Mammalogy, encapsulates, in my view, the notion that cetology and marine mammal science in general has gone through quite a transformation. No longer are scientists a dispassionate observer and solely focused on their research. Now we see biologists and scientists actively engaged in conservation efforts and advocating on behalf of their study subjects in ways we could have never imagined in the past. So cetology has come a long way since Aristotle made his first observations along the shores of the island of Lesbos some 2,400 years ago. And so to all the upcoming whale researcher students, and I hope some of you are watching today, know that you're walking in the footsteps of Aristotle. And for you, a lot of women here, you're in the footsteps of Madeleine Friand and Barbara Lawrence and many, many others. So, and getting to know the whales better each day. And with that, my talk ends. Of course, cetology continues, and I'll leave you here with this slide. So thank you so much for paying attention. We'll see. Hopefully I haven't bored you to death here. Okay.
Thank you, Ugo. So I have some comments here.
Okay, let me just, yeah.
So the illustrations are amazing. A truly fascinating presentation of the history of science and marine mammals. The illustrations help the presentation come alive.
I hope so.
Grateful for the breadth of your knowledge, Ugo, and that you share it so generously. Wow, thank you so much, Ugo. Thank you very much for such a wonderful lecture.
People haven't fallen asleep yet.
No, no. It was very interesting. So I know you have an extensive library collection. Where do you find some of these?
Oh God, from all over the place. Yeah, I'm so sleuthing. You find books along the way, and obviously I have a limited budget, so you have to be a smart hunter in these books. Well, first of all, I have to know what you're looking for. So what are the books that are of interest, and to me, I'm really looking more at books that are obviously more related to anatomy for my own personal work, of course. So.
And then we had a comment, so easy to forget about the incredible scientific history that brought us to where we are today. With the extensive research you have done, will you be considering a book on the history of cetology?
Yeah, it's something that's been percolating in my mind. And I've actually have talked to, and maybe I don't want to, but anyway, not now. It would be probably much later. Once I'm done, I'm just too busy right now. But majorly down the road is something that I could see myself writing something. I'd like to write this somehow on paper, or hopefully someone else can do it as well. But I even talked to Tom Jefferson and working together on book, but this might be a decade away still. So once we both have more time and maybe visit some museums and archives in Europe, for instance. So, but yeah, it's something in the back of my mind. I am. Yep.
And Jackie Hildering says, I too vote for Uko to do a book reflecting the knowledge in this presentation.
Well, if I do a book, there'll be many pictures in it too, because there's a rich illustrated. There's lots of beautiful plates and photos, and of course portraits of people, the men and yes, women who contributed to this field. So I'm hoping so.
And Sarah asked, you mentioned a digitized source of illustrations. Where is this?
Not illustrations. Well, there's a digitized. If you because people ask me in the last meeting with and Thursday too. People ask me, how do we get the access to these kind of books? And there are many ways. Of course, during the pandemic, many libraries are closed, but there is the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is online. And that has, they've scanned tens of thousands of books on natural history and many of the books on whales. Of course, you have to know what you're looking for, but you can find them all there. And it's all free. All these beautiful plates, you can find them. There are, depending on where you are, of course, there's some museum or university libraries will hold some of the more unusual books. There is, and actually Sally Misrock is online here too. So she is the keeper of the Dale Rice Library. The late Dale Rice was a wonderful researcher and contributed much to the taxonomy of whales, for instance, and wrote about systematics. But he was a collector of books, and that was preserved in the Dale Rice Library too. So if anyone happened to be in Seattle, if you want to go to Seattle, you have to make an appointment. You can find Dale Rice Library online, and which is really remarkable. So if you wanted to visit and you wanted to see, there's many of these books that I discussed here actually are in that library as well. So there is something about the actual book, thumbing through the pages, smelling it. It's like it's a tangible part of the history. To me, I have that. Some books have still the smell of the tobacco stained smells, and there has that sort of history is sort of baked in there, and some books even have their signature or even our presentation copies to colleagues. I still have those, and that is it's just an extra little history. There's something about old books that will never go out of fashion, will never be. But the Biodiversity Heritage Library is the best next thing to find books, and if that answers the question, unless I'm not sure if they were talking about illustration work. Okay, I've lost people here. You still there?
Sorry, Uko.
Yeah.
I had my microphone off. Okay.
That's good. Uh-oh.
No.
Talking to a screen here. Yeah.
Sarah said, yes, that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? We have a lot of thank yous and how enlightening and for sharing your knowledge. And
and I hope there's a lot of students actually here watching too. And that's probably also one of the reasons I gave this talk, because I've gone to so many biennial conferences, meeting up with a lot of students, and I often find, and actually not just the students, I even find more seasoned researchers too, they have very little knowledge about the people who went before them, and having an understanding of the older literature. And I think it's crucial. I think it's so important that you know the people who went before you, understand so for the students, I urge you to look at the history, look at the people who went before you, look at the old literature. And in some cases, a lot of these people, you think maybe old literature, these people are still very much alive, and if you look them up, find them, because I found a lot of the researchers are extremely gracious, and they actually love to hear from students. To say if you it's only particularly if it's in your field. So if I'm taking away message here to all the students, find these people, find some of the older, I hate to say it, researcher and scientists. They can impart you with a lot of advice. I think that's something that the Whale Watcher, I'm so proud of this too, because these 18 women who've written about the stories about their careers, to me, I think it would be wonderful, helpful for students, emerging students into getting into this field, giving us a sense of what other people have gone through who went before them. So anyway, that's my going off on a tangent here, but.
So in the chat box, Sally posted a link to
Super.
the Dale Rice
Yeah,
Memorial Research Library.
perfect.
And then we had several students
Good.
who mentioned that it was a great presentation and an excellent primer before taking marine mammalogy this summer. And another student in the UK who you have inspired to go take a look at some of the old literature.
Good.
And uh, did you know this is something I didn't know. Did you know that Powell's Bookstore, which is
Mhm.
a famous
Uh,
bookstore here in Oregon, has
Portland.
developed a perfume which smells like a bookstore full of books? I'm gonna have to check that out.
Oh dear God. Oh no, I don't have to do that. I can just smell some of the old stuff there behind me. But there's true. There's something about that. It's a smell of history. It's like some old, some of the old museums you go into have that same thing. I love it. Some people are like, oh, it's disgusting. I love it. But anyway, yeah.
All right. Somebody said better than smelling like whale blow.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, yeah. If any of you have gone through dissections or been anywhere close to a dead whale and that's being cut and opened, yeah, that's no fun thing. It's interesting though. You have to, uh, and that's something. If people ask me, it was on Thursday too. There's some question about that. Whether anatomy sort of informs my illustrations. It's absolutely true, and I think it's. So if anyone was you actually busy and like to do some whale drawing, it's good to know a little bit about the anatomy of whales. It helps you getting a sense of proportions and sense of what the whale looks like. It's starting with the skeleton, but it just yeah. So anatomy does inform illustrations. Certainly, for me, it is very crucial. I think that I know that.
All right.
Hmm.
Well, thank you very much, Uko.
Thank
Anyone
you
else
all.
have any questions?
And I'll share my email. You can find me much like what Sally did too with and Sally is also actually one of the people highlighted on our whale watchers. So there are lots of lots of researchers are always open. They are so gracious with their time. So you can find me too at uko@ukogorter.com. You can find me online too. If you have questions afterwards that something pops up, you can't think of it now, feel free to do that. And if you want a little bit more about some of the old publications, I can certainly give you a list or something like that. I had it earlier too, but anyway.
And I have to say that during the pandemic and I was off work and confined to home, I actually read Scammon's book
Oh
and
yeah,
found it to be very interesting.
it is. It is wonderful to read that, go back with the Scammons work. Yeah, that just if it is of course a snapshot in that time, but it's interesting to go through that. And I was like, wow, yeah, it just yep, yeah, very much so. And the old plates, of course, the old illustrations I need too. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Uko.
Thank
And
you all. Thank you, ACS Oregon, for inviting me, and I thank you for everyone for listening in and being bored to death here. I'm glad.
no, we found it interesting.
Good, good. I
So,
hope so.
all right. And I hope we'll see everybody in June for our next speaker when we have Alexandra Morton coming. So, thank you all.
Good. Thank you.